Thanks, Jim. Next up, we're going to ask Bhaskar Mazumdar from the Chicago Federal Reserve, RDC, to share his experiences with us. And we're lucky because he was in yesterday for a workshop over in the economics department. He stayed over to take part. He'll leave in the middle of this session to catch a flight. So,
yeah, I was going to mention that. And so if there are any questions that come up that you particularly want to ask me, feel free to give me an email since I'll be gone in the lunch and breakout periods. So yeah, let me just give you some background, some very specific stuff about what I've done in an RDC. So it all started for me as a graduate student at Berkeley, sitting in a labor economics class, and I had to present a paper that was a summary paper about research on intergenerational income mobility. And that got me really interested and excited. That was something I kind of had a passion for. I had this question in my head that started my interest in mobility, which was about affirmative action and the idea of thinking about exactly how long would one need affirmative action in order to remove, inequalities between, in this case, races, but more generally, how long does it take for income gaps in society to become eliminated? And it occurred to me, okay, here's a kind of body of research that gets at that kind of question. So I had that in the background. One day, talking to my advisor, David Card, a labor economist at Berkeley, going over dissertation ideas, and he mentioned, there's this data that you can get at the brand new Census Center, which links households to basically income data, administrative income data from Social Security, where you could track both parents' income going backwards in time and kids' income forwards in time. And now you've got kind of an intergenerational data set with income on both parents and kids. And that, that got me interested. I wrote a proposal, got in the Berkeley RDC. There are a few hiccups along the way. This is all old history, but there was a major hiccup between the Census Bureau and IRS. And I found myself spending the summer before the year I went on the job market at the Social Security Administration in Washington rather than in the RDC trying to write my job market paper. And to give you an idea of, I'll just talk briefly about the research itself. So the real advantage of using this data was in terms of measuring income streams over a longer period of time. So there was a Gary Becker, Nobel Prize-winning economist, gave a presidential address at the American Economics Association meetings in the early 90s talking about income mobility and talking about the body of research at that time that sort of suggested that, within a generation, about 80% of the gap in income between any two households would be removed in about a generation, so that essentially over about 3 generations, most income inequality between families would disappear. Okay, and then there was some research most notably by Gary Solon, a professor at the time at Michigan, using Michigan's PSID panel study on income dynamics data, which was the best intergenerational data set that's publicly available, and sort of showed, well, if you average parents' income over 5 years rather than just using 1 year of income, that actually smooths out a lot of measurement error and what economists call transitory noise relative to your sort of permanent level of income, and found that instead of 80% of income gaps being eliminated, it was more like 60% in a generation. So my research at the RDC, basically, I could now take a family and look at parents' income over 15, 20, 25 years. Not perfectly, there were some issues. But if you did that 60% going away in a generation became 40% going away in a generation. And, that research attracted a lot of attention, and even in this presidential campaign, Obama recently gave a speech talking about what are the chances of a kid growing up in poverty today attaining the middle class. And, I got a phone call 2 days before that speech from Alan Kruger, who's the, head of the Council of Economic Advisors, asking me to help him kind of make these calculations. And this all is because, one day my advisor told me about this topic, and the RDC existed and had the data available to do this kind of research. So it can have a, pretty important effect. So since then, I've gone back. There was a period where I'd lost access to the data. I moved to Chicago to be the director at the RDC and be an economist at the Fed. I reapplied for access to the same data, but now it was much better. In addition to Social Security earnings data, I also got access to W-2 data. So as you can imagine, this data is, among the most sensitive data that you can get in the RDC, and for that reason, it undergoes a lot of scrutiny. But, as Gail said, in his case, 10 years, in my case, a few years of pushing after this big disruption with the IRS, I was able to regain access to the data. Researchers today, with some effort, can gain access to the same data that I used, and there's lots of open, interesting questions that have yet to be resolved that you could use, intergenerational data to get at. So since then, I've looked at, and I think there's maybe a paper linked on the website, I have a recent working paper looking at how racial differences in intergenerational mobility, a descriptive paper looking at those. And in this case, again, there's a real advantage to using this data, the PSID data. While it's very nice, it's a relatively small sample that started with something like 5,000 households, but if you kind of follow it through, the number of African-American families that you can track intergenerationally gets to be quite small. The standard errors are pretty large on that, but with the census samples that I have access to, I'm able to get statistically significant estimates of intergenerational mobility differences between blacks and whites. So I'll just mention a couple of other examples of research that's happened in Chicago or that I talk about when I give kind of these sort of road shows to advertise the RDCs. So one example where, Gail talked about aggregate data doesn't cut it in terms of what we really want. So for example, in the field of international trade, in a series of papers, Andrew Bernard and Brad Jensen have used, firm level data on trade to really look at predictable hypotheses that come out of international trade theories and really advance the international trade literature. In another area, that people are interested in on the demographic side is patterns in segregation and models of segregation, and using the block level data from the decennial census, a lot of researchers have been able to make real progress. For example, Pat Bayer at Duke has done some really good work in that area. One other area, someone I went to grad school with, Darren Labotsky, has done some really great work on immigration, and this will connect to one piece of practical advice. We were asked to give some practical advice. What he realized is that what often researchers studying immigration did in the public use data was a key variable is the year of arrival of an immigrant. And in many of these surveys, you either didn't have that or you had them in these big buckets of 1980 to 85 or what have you. And what he realized was that in one of the census household surveys, in the actual questionnaire, you fill out the actual year of arrival. And things like that. So my practical advice is if you have a research question you're interested in and it involves potentially data available in the Census Center, go find the actual questionnaires and forms that ask about these things. We'll often talk about geographic detail or income top coding, but there's often other kinds of detailed information that nobody may actually even have thought about doing, but until you look at the questionnaire, you don't realize there's some real value to the non-public version of the survey data. So in Darren's case, he was actually able to use the exact year of arrival and then make more progress in terms of looking at the rates of immigrant assimilation in the U.S. So I think I'll maybe leave it at that. I don't know if we're take questions now. Or
what we're going to try to do this is to go back and forth. So we'll take a few minutes here for questions, maybe specific to this or more general. And yeah, if you'd like to start us off, would you mind identifying yourself?
My name is Alan Irving. I work for Texas Information and Referral Network, and I see our relationship with the center as possibly providing and possibly using information. So my question actually does relate to that specifically, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. What types of data does exist, and where are the sources of the data?
We've got a link at the website which takes you to compendiums. It's just listings. The Census Bureau's Center for Economic Studies has a number of lists of their own, and we've simply assembled them here. They're changing from time to time. If you follow the links that are here, if they're still working, actually, the CES has revised their website recently. We're trying to make sure we stay up with them. All of your standard census data sets, anything you're aware of, and there may be many that you're not, the business surveys are another group. In recent years, data sets managed by the National Center for Health Statistics, so their major health surveys, mortality data, birth data, and other things, administrative records from Social Security, IRS. These different sources, please jump in and correct me in a second if I leave something out or misspeak, but these different sources of data are potentially available. Whether you can touch them or not is going to be a different question to answer. It'll be based on your need for the project that you have and whether that project gets approved. But one of the things that Bosch was just referring to is the ability to merge data sets. And you might not even know that it's a possibility, but it may be. And that turns this research, amplifies the power of the available data. So that's maybe a taste. And if anybody would like to add more?
I think I would just say, we get this question all the time, what's available? So the short answer is anything census, if you've ever seen the Census Bureau publish in some sort of aggregate form, comes from some census survey. So I'll echo, so if you've seen aggregate statistics from the Census Bureau on something, then they got it from a survey. And I'll echo Bosch's recommendation then. Go find the actual survey form and think about what you would do if you had that information that's on that form for everybody that's either in the sample or in the case of some instances, the actual census, which is everybody. Listing off those files is hard to do, and usually people who are doing research know what kinds of information they've touched in published form, in aggregate form, and usually have that, I need to know more than this. So that's where you start thinking about what you would do if you had more.
Walt, would you let us know who you are, please? You're on TV.
I'm on TV. I'm Walt Peacock. I'm here in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Planning. I guess a key issue, the topics you're looking at are incredibly important, and many of us have written NSF grants and things like that. But would you speak about the benefit to the Census Bureau in terms of your justification for gaining access to that microdata? And that.
I could give us, I think it's always going to be very specific to the project you're dealing with. Beyond, the one benefit that's always there is essentially your research question and the results, the tables, output you produce. That's a benefit. On top of that, the kinds of things that come up are sometimes very specific to the data you're using. So in my case, I used a census household survey called the SIP. There was a series of very specific things that concerned the Census Bureau research methodology people conducting the survey. So, for example, how much does household attrition affect the representativeness of the sample? So that was something I could pose, even though it wasn't necessarily central to what I was doing. It plays some role because you might worry that my estimates might be affected somewhat by whether or not households leave the sample over time. So I would do, as part of my analysis, I would look at how the rates of attrition, say, are affected by characteristics of the household, present that in a short technical memo, and that would be part of my benefit to the Census Bureau. When I did my proposal, I would say I will study attrition. When I finish my project, I say here are the results, and that's kind of the typical kind of formula for. So you guys won't know what those things are, but the local census administrator will be well versed in that and will help guide you through the kinds of things that would naturally come out of your research that would benefit the Census Bureau.
Okay, let's keep moving. I know you had a question, but we'll have a chance to get to it, I'm sure. And next up,
let me just, for those of us who are on this side of the thesis and graduation process, now, we probably had that appendix that described all this stuff about the data that we are pretty sure that even our committee didn't read. Those are the places that those benefits to the Census Bureau lie. They're things that are the closest to the data, what you did with them, how you did QA, issues of the way the sample was designed, how you linked, pieces of information and what you found through that linking process. Those are the kinds of things that the Census Bureau are interested in. It's the kinds of things that the journal reviewers tell you to make available upon request. Census actually wants to know that stuff. And so lots of good research does that stuff anyway. We just have to think a little bit more about it in the proposal process and flesh that out so that Census understands that these are some of the things that you're going to be doing and you're going to be helping them understand about the data. And I think in broad terms, that's the best way to think about benefits, is kind of like that appendix to your thesis that you're pretty sure your committee didn't read. Census actually wants it.
Thanks.